You bet. I'd like to welcome everybody here today and thank you for joining us as we engage in this important discussion about our American River Basin Study, climate change impacts and strategies. My name is Robert Dugan. I'm on the Placer County Water Agency Board of Directors, as well as a board member for our Regional Water Authority and a number of other water collaboratives throughout the region. I apologize for any background noise when I'm speaking, but when we get done with the presentation today, you'll understand why I'm actually on the Hill this week in Washington. So I've got a little background noise. With that, I just want to say it is so wonderful to see so many folks attending today, and you'll see several elected officials and staff members from multiple agencies in today's presentation, because this is a challenge that we have to tackle together. If we're going to be successful, and we can be, as we build resilience and sustainability in the face of our changing climate and changing weather patterns, it's going to be because we come together as agencies and electeds. And so with that, I want to open the dialogue today by introducing a longstanding advocate and champion for all these issues, and that is Congresswoman Doris Matsui. And I really appreciate the Congresswoman finding time today. She's got votes today. The House is in motion right now, so I'm going to introduce her quickly so we get her before she needs to run out. But Doris has represented the city of Sacramento and surrounding areas since 2005, and I've had the pleasure of benefiting from her collaborative approach on so many things since that time. She's a senior member of House Energy and Commerce Committee, which is absolutely critical to everything we do in California. She also serves on the Health and Energy Subcommittee and is vice chair on the Communications and Technology Subcommittee. Specific to today, I want to point out she also serves as co-chair of the Sustainable Energy and Environment Coalition and the Congressional High Tech Caucus. The Congresswoman has been so good to our region, has been a longstanding champion, as we know, for our flood protection, which has benefited from her dedicated effort, time in bringing people together and bringing resources to our region. In her long time in Washington, she's fought for those bold federal investments that minimize our flood risk and also increase that partnership between flood and the environment and water supply. And these things have really resulted in a transformational effort that has shown things like a new spillway for Folsom, giving us greater flexibility, the Natomas Levee project, and even is inspired with a collaborative project up in the Sierras with a spillway project. As co-chair of Sustainable Energy and Environment Coalition, she's been a congressional leader on the forward-thinking climate policies, practical climate policies that we can put in motion, and has spearheaded efforts that promote climate resilience and protect our communities. So with that, I'd like to say thank you and turn it over to our Congresswoman, Doris Matsui. Welcome, Congresswoman.
Oh, good morning, everyone. It's really great to be here to say a few words. And thank you very much, Robert. We worked together for a very long time. For a while, I felt like we were always together when we're dealing with some of the issues of Folsom and the Joint Federal Project and everything. But listen, this is wonderful to have this briefing for the American River Basin Study. And I want to thank the Bureau of Reclamation, Placer County Water Agency, the City of Sacramento, the Sacramento Flood Control Agency, Regional Water Authority, El Dorado Water Agency, and the cities of Roseville and Folsom for working together on this important study, and for inviting me to just say a few words on this issue today. This study has been years in the making, and we are fortunate to finally have these results. Now, this is a seminal moment for the American River watershed, and the study will help us find the pathway forward. We've all seen the way climate change is really impacting our lives, from rising temperatures to atmospheric rivers and megastorms. The effects of the climate crisis are becoming harder and harder to ignore. The mosquito fire has taken a terrible toll in Placer County over the last few weeks, and my heart goes out to the many families and businesses that have been impacted. As climate change continues to accelerate, we must adapt our strategies to keep pace with the increasing rate of change. The snowpack is shrinking, the wet season is becoming shorter and more intense, and sea levels are rising. We must adapt to a warmer future that includes less snow and more rain, longer, drier spells, and more intense storms. We owe it to our future generations, our children, our grandchildren, and beyond, to leave them a planet that is respected and taken care of in a way that we can be proud of. I look forward to working with all of you to meet this challenge and ensure the American River can be enjoyed and utilized responsibly for generations to come. Thank you for having me here today and spending this little time to learn about this important study. Thank you so much. I appreciate everything that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman Matsui. And again, we so appreciate you've been so far ahead of the curve in helping us make things happen in this region. I do want to remind you, you probably remember, but several of us on this call sat in your office back in 2016 and asked you to help us get this study started by supporting our request to the Bureau of Reclamation. So she's been with us since the beginning on this, and we're really appreciative of her leadership. So with that, we're going to get started with a handful of presentations that will take you through the kaleidoscope of opportunities. But before I do that, I need to do a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, wanted to make sure everyone knew that this webinar is being recorded so that we can make it available to those that weren't able to join us. A live transcript is available to you by clicking on the live transcript button, and it's on the bottom of your screen. So you'll see it down there. It says CC, and you can follow along if that's helpful to you. And finally, we really want you to submit questions. Please use the Q&A function. There's a Q&A button at the bottom. Please use that function to submit your questions so that time allotting we'll be able to get to some of them. And those that we don't get to, we'll be able to provide responses back to all of you. So with that, how about if we get going with the program? So if we can pull up the next slide. If we could move forward with the slide deck. There we go. First up, to talk about specifically climate impacts and adaptation strategies that we've developed is going to be Andy Fecco, the General Manager of Placer County Water Agency. Andy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Robert. I appreciate the opportunity to share some of the results that we've experiencing here in the American River Basin Study and some of our adaptation strategies. We've got a great panel of presenters here. So my job today is to go through some of the technical details of the findings. And yeah, as Robert said, please use the function here to ask questions as we go, because this is complicated stuff. So I'm going to try to boil it down for you. Next slide, please. So about the basin study, right? So this is, I think, one of the most sophisticated technical efforts that's been undertaken to date in any watershed in the U.S. on the impacts of potential climate change. The forecasts, it looks at potential impacts to water supply, water quality, and to our critical habitats, both in the upper watershed and in the lower part of the American River. Happily, it outlines 6 potential strategies for adapting to our changing climate. And why is that important? It's important because we want to keep Sacramento and the American River Basin one of the most sustainable places to live in California. And a bedrock principle of that is we have to ensure our water supply reliability into the future. So as Congresswoman Matsui mentioned, this study was, PCWA was the primary leader on the technical side. We couldn't have done this without the United States Bureau of Reclamation, who did much of the technical work in their Denver Technical Services Office, the cities of Roseville and Sacramento and Folsom, the Sacramento Area Flood Control Agency, the Regional Water Authority, and the El Dorado Water Agency. This is a cross-section of the agencies that serve the population and where we live in this region, but also are responsible for maintaining the ecosystem of the lower American River, and the health of the upper American River watershed. Okay, what's the study area? So the study area encompasses the upper watershed. You can see here the North Fork American River, the Middle Fork American River, the South Fork American River, as well as the Cosumnes, Folsom Reservoir, and the Lower American, but importantly, also looks at the groundwater basins that underlie our region. It's important to look at the groundwater basins because they are a critical part of our future, which is to try and replace a vanishing snowpack with groundwater storage that's available to us right under our feet. So let's talk about bottom line impacts. Reduced snowpack in the upper watershed. It directly impacts water supply reliability, power generation, forest health, and recreation for upstream communities. Snowpack is currently our largest storage device. It takes snow that falls through the winter and currently melts slowly all the way into July and August that helps replenish our reservoir system. And without that snowpack, we lose our major storage reservoir. Increased flood risks in the winter. If precipitation is not falling as snow, but instead falls as rain, flood risk goes up. And you're going to hear more about that from the Sacramento Flood Control Agency in a moment. It prompts more flood releases from Folsom Reservoir, and it decreases runoff in the spring, making the region more vulnerable to water shortages as we go through our long, hot, dry summers. Importantly, as Congresswoman Matsui mentioned, to Placer and El Dorado counties in particular, increased risk for wildfires from drier soils and drier fuels in the upper watershed, and decreased flows and increased water temperatures in the lower American River in the summer and fall, which threatens our marquee species here, our native Chinook salmon, as well as our steelhead trout. So let's look at this. How much temperature increase? So this is our predicted air temperature increases, average annual mean temperature by the year 2085. This is a tremendous impact and a very powerful driver of the kinds of adaptation strategies we need to undertake. A 4 to 7 degree Fahrenheit increase. Particularly vulnerable is the upper watershed. And of course, that directly translates to loss of snowpack. How does it occur? It occurs primarily, as we've been seeing in the last 50 years, with increased overnight temperatures. That is, that the temperatures don't cool off as much at night. And I think many of us that live in the upper watershed are experiencing just that thing now. And we expect that that trend will continue. And that means that we don't have as many frost days, which means we don't get as much snow. And then, of course, spring comes earlier, which means snowmelt occurs faster. Change in runoff timing. Here's a graphic depiction of that. Increases in fall and winter runoff, which means, again, we're not storing water as snow. It's falling as rain and immediately running off. And then a decrease in spring and summer as that snow melt does not hold on into the summer period, which means we're going to be more reliant on local storage. Changes in runoff volume. So many people think of climate change as meaning a drier climate in the future, and that's not necessarily true. What is true is that we may get the same amount of runoff, but it'll be compacted into a shorter winter period, which means we have to find a way to put that runoff to use and to store it locally. This is perhaps the scariest slide of this slide deck, which is that because we don't have a snowpack that's metering off runoff into the summertime, Folsom Reservoir, which is already small for the size of the watershed, loses storage faster and drops to lower elevations in more years. And so in those dry scenarios like we're experiencing currently, and like we experienced in 2013, 2014, and 15, when we have multiple years of dry, there is a much higher likelihood that Folsom hits dead pool conditions, which means we can't withdraw water for local use, and the lower American River suffers as well. Next slide, please. There we go, water temperature. So what happens to water temperature? So salmon are cold water species, steelhead are cold water species. They're used to migrating into the upper watershed during the summer and fall to escape high water temperatures that would have occurred in the valley floor. Because they don't have the ability to migrate to upper watersheds anymore, we rely on releases from Folsom Reservoir to sustain the lower American River, especially when it comes to temperature. This is going to become increasingly difficult. As the climate warms, as water temperatures warm, and as snowpack disappears, it will be very difficult to maintain adequate water temperature for salmon and steelhead in the lower American River without the adaptation strategies that you're going to hear about later on today. So the need for water, even with conservation, is going to grow by 7 to 8% in this region due to more prolonged and hotter summers. So as summers get hotter, our plants, our crops that we grow in this region are going to use more water, and we're going to use more water overall because summers are going to tend to be longer. That is, spring comes earlier and fall starts later. And so the adaptation strategies that you're going to hear about are designed to replace snowpack with other sources of water, other sources of storage, and other ways to move water around the region. The valley floor is expected to need 10 to 30,000 acre feet more water, and the foothills are expected to need 80 to 120,000 acre feet more water, and depends on where you live, how that's going to impact this region. So good news is we can adapt. This is a scary story without adaptation. But what this study does is lays out 6 adaptation strategies, and we're going to focus on 3 of those today, but we're happy to answer questions on any of them. The Sacramento Regional Water Bank, which is a program that is up and running now and is slated to grow. The adaptations by the Sacramento Area Flood Control Agency to keep us all safe in this region, and the El Dorado Water Agency's efforts to increase upper watershed surface storage. Let me also talk just a little bit about watershed health. My agency, El Dorado Water Agency, EID, we're all engaged in upper watershed projects to look at forests of the future. It is a critical adaptation strategy so that we have forests to enjoy. The species that live in those forests have places to live while we figure out our climate mitigation. We also need to save our forests. We'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. If we do nothing, this is a scary story. Doing nothing is not an option in our view, and that's why we're working so hard as a region to move towards adaptation. And I think that concludes my part of this presentation, and I should hand it over to Mr. Pfeiffer to talk about the Sacramento Regional Water Bank.
Good morning, everyone. I am Jim Pfeiffer. I am the Executive Director of the Regional Water Authority. Thank you very much, Mr. Fecco. Next slide, please. So we talked about the potential for losing our snowpack or the prediction of losing our snowpack in the future. And we'd like to show this photograph showing the snowpack of the Sierra Nevada. You can see Lake Tahoe on this photograph. And the snowpack right now is vast. We rely on this as our snow reservoir. And historically, we've relied on it to provide water supply, a reliable water supply throughout the year. Unfortunately, it's going to disappear quite a bit in the future. It's going to diminish. We have relied on the snowpack to fill surface water reservoirs. And you see a little surface water reservoir. It's this bluish gray speck on this photograph. That's Folsom Reservoir. In the future, more of the water is going to come down in late winter, early spring, and that's at a time where we like to reserve a lot of that space in a reservoir for flood control. So when we want to be releasing water for flood control, the runoff is going to come down from the mountains. But I also want to share with you the census scale of the groundwater basin that we could rely on. The groundwater basin is vast, and it will be really helpful for us to develop and to be able to adapt, to put water away into the groundwater basin when it's plentiful, and be able to take it out of the groundwater basin when surface water is not plentiful. Groundwater storage needs to be built into California's vision of the future. So I wanted to share this slide with you also. It shows the groundwater level trends throughout the Sacramento and San Joaquin Valley in the past. And many of you might have heard about challenges with groundwater and the use of groundwater. You've heard about the land surface declining. I want to talk about what we've done within our region. 25 years ago, the leaders of this region started to build infrastructure to be able to manage groundwater and surface water together in a partnership. They call that conjunctive use. And what has happened is the groundwater levels within the Sacramento region started to go up. That's a real success story, but it was done because of the investments made within this region and the programs that were made. The Sacramento Groundwater Authority was created to help manage groundwater in this region and ensure that it was used as a reliable resource, a sustainable resource. This, is again a kind of a sad story throughout California. We see declining groundwater levels in the Tulare Lake Basin and the San Joaquin River, but because this region made those investments, once again, we see levels increasing and you see those green spots throughout the Sacramento region. That's a good news story. This is information taken from the State Department of Water Resources Bulletin 118. They update that from time to time. So this is data from the state of California. Next slide, please. That gets us to this solution that we call the water bank. Essentially, how the water bank would work is when there is plenty of surface water available, we use that and serve it throughout the region. And we turn off groundwater wells to areas that have historically used groundwater. This is how we had that success story of groundwater levels rising within the region. Essentially, we turned off our groundwater wells. In some cases, we injected water into the ground. In the future, we might be flooding farm fields during the wintertime when there's a lot of water available to help add to the bank. When it's dry, we recover that water. We use more of that groundwater that we've saved, that we've put into the bank. Again, this is a partnership between groundwater and surface water. We manage those resources to get together and that we can save water for a dry day. Next slide, please. I wanted to share this slide also. It shows the potential of groundwater storage within California. This is another exhibit from the state of California. We have about 50 million acre feet of developed surface water reservoirs in the future. We hope to add to a little bit. We hope that Sites Reservoir comes online in the near future to add to this. But there is a great capacity to develop groundwater basins within the region, within California. There is about 1 billion acre feet in California's 515 groundwater basins that we could potentially develop to store water. Next slide, please. The state of California recognizes the potential for the storage. Wade Crowfoot, our Secretary of Natural Resources, testified before Congress and made this remark as part of his overall remarks when he was discussing the need for federal funding for infrastructure. I also want to share this graphic on the right of the slide. This is from the Public Policy Institute of California. There's 4 million acre feet of water available for recharge in the Sacramento Valley. That is more than the overdraft in the San Joaquin River Basin and the Tulare Lake Basin. That's also a good news story, but we need to put this to work. And the way that we do that is through building infrastructure, investments to be able to store that water underground and be able to use it in the future. Next slide. So this morning, I wanted to share this proven concept with you. We have success within the region, managing groundwater. Groundwater levels are going up. We were able to add additional storage capacity in the last 20 years to the tune of about 30,000 acre feet. This is going to be a key feature for our adaptation for climate change, but we need your help. We need you to support our solution by helping out with the water bank. And what I mean by that is the leaders of our region advocating for funding to build these facilities. And those opportunities exist in the bipartisan infrastructure law and state funding opportunities in the future. And with that, I'm going to come back to questions at the tail end of this presentation and address those. Thank you very much. Next up is Gary Bardini, the Director of Planning for the Sacramento Area Flood Control Agency. Gary, please take it away.
Great. Well, thank you, Jim. So Gary Bardini, and I serve as the Director of Planning for Sacramento's Area Flood Control Agency. I thought I'd start with this first slide, which kind of reflects the tireless efforts really starting since 1986, when essentially the Sacramento region had a very, very significant high water event that was very close to topping the levees along the American River. Since that period, there's been significant efforts to improve flood control. We hope by the end of 2025, we will essentially, with these 6 authorized projects with the Corps of Engineers, the city, should we look to obtain about 300-year protection, where we're currently at somewhere just less than 100. A lot of this is a number of projects, but I'd like to really acknowledge the tireless efforts of Congresswoman Matsui, along with the SAFCA board. I'd like to highlight both Jeff Harris and Patrick Kennedy on our board for the tireless efforts to really move these projects forward. These 6 authorized projects represent essentially around $5 billion of investment, both federal, state, and local. Next slide, please. So taking those 6 authorized projects, it has translated to a number of actions in the Sacramento region, starting at Folsom with not only the Joint Federal Project Spillway Project that was recently completed, or the current efforts to raise 3.5 feet at Folsom, or improvements down on the American River, where we're looking to be able to increase the capacity safely of passing higher flows, and then doing a lot of levee improvements, both in the Natomas area and of course in the South Sacramento region. Next slide. So part of the program of improvement, as I kind of showed, is that, since 1986 until through 25, we hope to complete a number of efforts. I've talked about the reoperation and improvements at Folsom, a number of strengthening projects that we're currently working with the Corps of Engineers, the Bureau of Reclamation, and with the state of California. But, we're wanting to move from essentially the 200 to 300-year level to a much higher level of protection. So that's why we're continuing with conveyance improvements in the Folsom raise. And then we're looking now to look and link in with the upstream reservoirs in a watershed FERO, and then of course, furthering our improvements at Yolo Bypass. Next slide. So with these efforts, we hope that moving with the improvements at the Folsom and with the channels improvements, with the forecasting advancements, we'd like to move to essentially maybe from 250 to 350, with looking at potentially going with advances further in FERO and looking at upstream reservoirs. Right now, Hellhole, we have an active effort. We'd hope that we can achieve above 400 level of protection. And then if we link in a number of other reservoirs, Union Valley and French Meadows, we hope that at that point we would be able to achieve 500. Next slide, please. A little bit of the catalyst for that need to get to higher and higher level of protection, as we've already seen from our earlier presentations, the aspects of climate and the aspects of where we're looking at future efforts where the reoccurrence of floods are going to be more extreme in the future, let alone the shift. It's very clear that the adaptation of continue to go to higher and higher protection is necessary. And then Congresswoman Matsui highlighted that point. Within that, I'd like to acknowledge the occurrence difference, but also acknowledge, as Andy Facker talked about, that more and more our water supply operations will be more in the flood operations. So with that in mind, go to the next slide. SAFCA has been looking to then further what I would call watershed FERO with managed aquifer recharge to basically not only deal with improving the flood protection I just went over, but also improve water management in the region. Opportunities to look at them where we can operate better, where the flood and the water management seasons are both coinciding more and more together in the future. And then highlighting on what Jim Pfeiffer went over about groundwater management, we'd like to try to see if we can then link those management upstream and reservoir operations to better groundwater management downstream. Next slide, please. I really want to highlight that this effort of doing a watershed FERO, as we call in the basin study, the Folsom Dam Raise groundwater banking. We evaluated that as a portfolio along with the other 6 that Andy already described. And we see that it provides a number of benefits evaluated. It can be from water supply to resource management, operational flexibility, and other institutional improvements. We see that this effort can provide broad benefits to the region. Next slide. So a little bit on the steps moving forward. SAFCA, to further what we would call a flood MAR, FERO MAR project, requires quite a bit of effort and coordination among a lot of institutional management. On the left, I've just highlighted 13 main issues or themes that the California Department of Water Resources has identified when trying to move forward with a project that requires a flood MAR, FERO MAR. Those require us then to navigate not just the flood institutional management from forecasting or reservoir operations, furthering how we do better water management, as I've described, and how we can improve resource management. And then, of course, putting through a number of institutional managements that's going to be required, let alone looking for additional funding. All of these efforts are where SAFCA, along with our regional partners, with the federal government, the state, are all working together to continue to progress this. So with that, I'd like to close it with that this will be a tireless effort, but the time is now to move forward. These things take time to bring to readiness, and we look forward to advancing this with our partners. So with that, I'd like to then turn it over to my colleague, Ken Payne, General Manager of the El Dorado Water Agency.
Thanks, Gary. So my name is Ken Payne. I'm the General Manager for El Dorado Water Agency. I'm going to discuss the Alder Creek Reservoir and Conservation Project. This portfolio illustrates an example to use a high elevation off-stream reservoir to replace lost storage from reduced snowpack and the anticipated earlier stormwater runoff. It also looks to improve water supply reliability for the foothill rural communities and improve CVP water supply operational flexibility at Folsom Reservoir, while also providing an opportunity to preserve some of the recreational activities along the upper portions of the American River. Next slide, please. The reservoir is located up along Highway 50 on the south side of Highway 50. If you're familiar with Ice House Reservoir on the north side, it's due south of that reservoir. It's located about 5,500 feet in elevation. And the location of the reservoir is at the convergence of a couple of granite formations along Alder Creek. And this is an ideal spot because it actually has steep slopes and a really deep confined reservoir rather than some of the shallow, broad reservoirs that we commonly see in California. This smaller footprint reduces some of the losses for evaporation and the evaporation volume ratio, which will be important as we see rising temperatures, particularly in the upper portions of the watershed. One of the reasons this project's needed is to address some of the limitations we have in the American River Basin. As previously stated, Folsom Reservoir is our primary reservoir, but it's also one of the smaller reservoirs in the Central Valley Project system. And its ability to handle increased flood runoffs and challenges, it presents a challenge for our region. In the upper portions of the watershed, the foothills has no alternative water supply except for surface water resources. We don't have any meaningful groundwater storage or supplies within the upper areas of the shed. This project's also consistent with the governor's water resilient portfolio that recognizes the need to develop storage projects. Next slide. When we look at some of the project benefits, in regard to water supply, you're looking at a decreased reliance on Folsom Reservoir for both El Dorado County and for the city of Folsom. It'll provide addresses some of the imbalance. We're expecting somewhere between 63 to 83,000 acre feet of shortfall by 2070 under the anticipated changes of climate change. So this project will also help provide some operational flexibility for reclamation on water supply and also to address some of the flood risk management aspects of it. This project, combined with Folsom Dam raise with the groundwater banking, the Alder portfolio actually will enhance the flood risk management functions of Folsom Reservoir by intercepting flows upstream of Folsom and reducing the peak flows in the lower American River. This also increased the regulatory capacity of Folsom Dam and would not impact reclamation's operations to downstream areas and could store flood flows for use by reclamation during the summer months. And that's a critical element of the advantage of this reservoir. Is the storage for releases during the summer months. Next slide. When you look at some of the hydropower, recreational, fish and wildlife habitat protection benefits, combine these three areas of benefit rely on releasing the water from Alder during the peak months, during these peak summer release times. Hydropower, during these peak summer periods, we're looking at a total capacity of 110 megawatts with an annual power generation of 470,000 megawatt hours. Recreation-wise, the summer releases would increase Folsom Reservoir storage in the summer and fall, and also provides some greater flexibility for recreational activities for whitewater rafting, the swimming, the fishing up in the upper areas. With regards to fish and wildlife habitat protection, the high elevation deep storage configuration that I talked about earlier provides some flexibility to manage the cold water pool as we go down into the American River, flows down the American River. This improves the flow and temperature conditions for the lower American River and shifts the timing of the release for fish and wildlife habitat or water supply needs. Next slide. Our next steps, Reclamation and the El Dorado Water Agency are working to initiate the federal feasibility study that was enacted by Congress for $3 million back in 2004. So this feasibility study will evaluate the proposed portfolio and include some of the modeling, more enhanced modeling of the north and middle and south forks of the American River. Where we really need support is securing some integrated state and federal support to begin the evaluation of this climate adaptation portfolio. What I mean by that is there's elements in there looking at establishing the storage exchange, capacity exchange, other operational agreements to ease demands on Folsom River. Those discussions need to happen soon. The institutional exchanges and operational agreements to augment water supply reliability for water purveyors in the foothills needs to be recognized. And to build flexibility to participate in the occasional water marketing transfer program will be critical for some of the financial needs for paying for this adaptation portfolio. So given that, concludes my presentation. I'm going to return it back to Mr. Dugan to give some closing remarks. Robert?
I'd like to thank our panelists today for laying out some of the options that we've developed in the region. Obviously, some of them have been years in the making already. We're close on a couple of them. Heck, we even have reason to believe Sites Reservoir might break ground in the next couple of years. And others are longer term. But, you know, it's this kind of suite of opportunities we need to be ready for. So I do want to encourage everybody to, while I'm talking, put your questions in the Q&A, because we're going to go to those right after I close here. And I want to thank you all for participating today. You know, we've got some really good news in the face of this very significant risk that we're facing. You know, the first piece is that our region, our watershed, maybe I should say our supershed, has the ideal geology and hydrology to adapt to these risks and create a 21st century water system that is sustainable and reliable. We're well positioned. The second piece of good news is, as you can see, regionally, we've worked together to do our homework. We have made sure that no stone is unturned, no dialogue turned away, as we engage with one another and develop solutions, because there is no one silver bullet to this challenge. We've got to, you know, I always say, if you can't store it white, you've got to store it wet. We know what's going to happen to snowpack. You know, that's predictable. And we've got plans and we've got options. And that's really terrific. But that's in large part due to the hard work that staff and electeds have done over the years as we prepare for this. As we look at our suite of solutions above ground and below ground, improved forest protections, improved forest health, which maximizes snow capture and turns it into water, we can ensure that our region will be resilient. We can be more insulated from these weather extremes, from these climate patterns. We can ensure that our communities have the water they need to continue to grow and prosper. And we can sustain our environment and the species that we're mandated to do. These projects are not only vital to our communities, but they're also vital to the statewide water supply and delivery system, because what we do upstream affects everybody downstream as well. And as a group of agencies, we are very engaged in our responsibility, because we are where the water starts and because we do have the privilege of managing and having water supplies. We have an obligation, and we know it, for the rest of the state in the dialogue that's going on. So with that, we're urging the state and federal government to make investments in our region. We know there's significant funding in the recently passed pieces of legislation in Congress. We know that that money's starting to flow, but we need to make sure it flows to our region. We have to compete to get our fair share of the federal support that is going to help us adopt all of these strategies and be water resilient. If we don't compete and make our voices heard in concert with one another loud enough, then that's on us. So shame on us. And I say that as an elected. It's on us to make sure that happens. As I think Andy pointed out, lack of action is not an option. Lack of action is actually a conscious decision to give up and to concede. So that brings me to the last piece of good news, and that is we have a history of collaboration in our region. As I pointed out, you know, I've been darkening the doorways of members like Congresswoman Doris Matsui for years, and other members of Congress and our senators have successfully collaborated to help us deliver solutions and to help get this process started many years ago. And now we're here with the suite of options. So I'm going to close with this, and then we're going to turn it over to Q&A. So that's your last reminder to get your questions in. We've got to be together. If we're not together on this, we lose. So there's going to be a day very soon where we all are asking the agencies and the elected officials in our region to step up and vocalize their support for our comprehensive solution. The ask may come in the form of letters or phone calls or resolutions for your council or your board. It can even be a rally at the state capitol if we think that's necessary, but everything's on the table and we're going to need to work together cooperatively. If agencies break off, that will ensure no success and therefore no solution. So we're encouraging everybody to work together. I know we've got a lot of terrific partners on this call that understand that very point. I'm right now in DC because these fires created some additional risks and some additional opportunities, the mosquito fire. So I'm back here knocking on doors, trying to produce some returns for the region. And there will be times when all of us need to take that opportunity. With that, I think I'm going to turn it over, since I've got to run off to a meeting with a senator here. I'm going to turn it over to Jim Pfeiffer to manage through the Q&A. And I want to thank everybody for participating in today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, and good luck. I want to take the first question because one of our audience members asked a question. There's a lot of contamination in the Sacramento groundwater basin. How will the quality be of the banked water compared to higher quality snowpack? So that contamination is contained. We monitor for that. We try to make sure it doesn't spread in other locations. What I want to also say is we have about 1.8 million acre feet of groundwater banking capacity under our feet within the region, nearly twice the size of Folsom Reservoir. So we have a lot of opportunity to bank water, but also we need to manage water underground in a way that we don't have challenges in the future. So again, we manage it to contain that contamination so it doesn't migrate off. Mr. Fecco, there's a quick question here. Has PCWA looked at climate change impacts on the people living in the foothills?
Yeah,
With
excellent
fractured
question.
groundwater?
Yeah, excellent question from Mr. Estes. So, yeah, not only PCWA, but Nevada Irrigation District, El Dorado Irrigation District are keenly aware that many people in the foothills and the mountain regions rely on groundwater wells that don't tap into an aquifer, but tap into fractured rock. Those wells are uniquely susceptible to reduced snowpack and flashier runoff because they don't fill as much. So I'll tell you, at PCWA, with the help of the state of California, we are in a massive consolidation effort to get folks connected to our surface water systems so that they have a reliable source of water for their homes and businesses. Because we do think that that situation with fractured groundwater wells is going to get worse in the future. I can't overstate how important the partnership is with the state of California. These are costly systems to build. We're in the effort right now of rebuilding our Colfax water treatment plant and extending a pipeline down the Highway 80 corridor so that folks that have traditionally only had access to fractured rock groundwater wells are going to have access to surface water in the future. And the state of California is interested in making sure that every Californian, right, every Californian has access to clean, reliable drinking water. And we're happy to be their local partners on that.
Thank you, Mr. Fecco. Mr. Payne, I was wondering if you could take the question on Alder Creek Reservoir. Specifically, any environmental hurdles and, oh, you're off mute. Thank you.
Oh, so the question is environmental hurdles facing Alder Reservoir. Well, we're just starting to look at that project, waiting for the feasibility study to begin. But the initial hurdles are, the advantage of the reservoir location is offstream, out of sight, but it's also below some of the disturbed tree lines. So your some of the areas that we're affecting are already been impacted by some of the forestry and some of the mining efforts in that area. So that's to advantage. Above Alder Reservoir, the tree lines and the forests are pretty well established, and those are the areas that we're not looking at. With regards to fish, we're anticipating some comments from the Sport Fishing Association and whatnot for some of the local fisheries, fishing activities and whatnot. So, but right now, those are probably the two biggest areas that we're expecting.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. We are getting a lot of questions. Mr. Fecco, I was wondering if you could take one from Kaylee Bright. Do you have connections on current efforts to strengthen forest health, and do you envision supporting those efforts in the future?
Yeah, so I know that many of the foothill water agencies are keenly interested in watershed health from the standpoint of water quality and water quantity going forward. And I think we're all doing forest management projects in the watershed. They need more support, right? We are not at the pace and scale necessary to avoid the kinds of mega fires that we're seeing, things like King Fire, Caldor Fire, Mosquito Fire, which is just still burning up in the watershed, right? And so this is a joint effort of that's going to require massive federal investment, massive state investment. The good news is We're starting to build traction on those investments. It costs a lot of money to do sustainable forest management efforts that we can all rely on in the future. And yeah, we welcome all partners on that, particularly to get the kind of infrastructure we need in place, whether that's biomass facilities, wood utilization facilities, the kinds of things that can utilize this wood that's coming out of our forests, which are dramatically overstocked, far in excess of historic conditions. And we need to get back to those historic conditions where we can begin to have healthy fire in these watersheds without fear of burning down our communities.
Thank you very much. A few questions about the water bank I want to take. One thing is Dave Peterson is asking about adaptation strategies. I think this might be directed to you, Andy, but I also am feasibility studies. Specifically, the question is do you and USBR have plans for a feasibility study? I can say, Mr. Peterson, for the water bank, yes, we do. We have engaged with U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. We have received funding. We are now on the process of developing what that feasibility study would look like in the future. Andy, I don't know if you want to provide any more thoughts.
Yeah, and all these adaptation strategies are at varying levels of development. So the River Arc study to shift some of our surface diversions over to the Sacramento River, for instance, is well on its way to an environmental document now with a partnership. Gary Bardini mentioned the SAFECA efforts. Those are well along their way. And so this is not something that we've stood still on while this study is being done. What the study does do is sharpen our focus on those and really gives us a good feeling of what kind of partnerships we need, what kind of investments it's going to take to replace snowpack with alternative means of storage.
Okay, looks like we have time for maybe 2 more questions. Lots of good questions coming up. Andy, could you talk about how PCWA is funding expansion of treated surface water? And then I want to leave another one for Mr. Bardini, who hasn't had a lot of questions. We have one teed up for him too.
Yeah, so we're making those investments in partnership with the state of California because we have a lot of underserved communities, and the state of California is very interested to consolidate systems that are at risk and that serve underserved communities. So we're tapping into a funding stream that the legislature has approved over the last several years. And we're also using money of our own that we have in reserve from our ratepayers to help connect new customers to our system. It probably wouldn't be possible if we were doing it on our own. So Mr. Dugan mentioned partnership. It's critically important that we have partners in this because it's very difficult to have just an insulated business model on connecting these communities that are oftentimes sparsely populated.
Thank you. Mr. Bardini, we only just have a few minutes left. I was wondering if you could answer the 200-year flood control level in 1 minute, and then I'm going to do some wrap up.
Okay, I could probably do it in 10 seconds, but the 200 is our objective to get above it, but we're likely through the project I described to get an approach near 300. So I've tried to provide a little additional context to the question and the comment. So that's, but really we're trying to meet, which is under SB 5, which is legislation by the state. The urban areas like Sacramento need to be at least at 200-year level of protection by 2025.
Thank you. Thank you very much, participants. And I'm going to make a few concluding remarks today. As you have heard, climate change will have tremendous impacts on our region. The intensity, timing, and form of water that we get in ways that our current system really can't handle, and we need to adapt to the future and build the investments that will help us. We know there's more to do. We've done our homework and we've developed our solutions. We've presented 3 here today. There have been questions on what are the other 3. I think that we need to also expose this audience on what those other solutions are. Stay tuned. We know there's no silver bullet for adapting to climate change, that there are a suite of solutions that we have to implement. These solutions can help ensure our region is resilient to future climate change. we can have greater regional self-determination over meeting the needs of our communities and our environment. We can keep our region on a trajectory of economic growth and prosperity. As a source watershed, adapting will help add yield and provide yield the benefits for California's water supplies and the environment. But we're going to need your help. We need to compete for our fair share of funding that's available so that we don't burden ratepayers and we continue to make sure that water rates are affordable for our customers. We will be sending a link to the webinar recording and some additional information. We really appreciate your time today. Thank you for listening, and we hope you have a great day.